We are in Corpus Christi College, Cambridge, in the context of the After Science and Religion conference, with Peter Harrison from the University of Queensland, a historian of science and author of Territories of Science and Religion, a recent book on the history or prehistory of these two domains. Dear Peter, first of all, thank you for taking the time for this short interview. The popular idea, the popular conception is that there is a prehistorical conflict between science and religion. But what's your take on that? And put it thusly.
Well, I think along with a number of other historians over the past 20 or 30 years, we've discovered that the history of science-religion relations is very complicated and complex. And we don't see any overarching pattern, certainly not a pattern of conflict. So often we see independence, we sometimes see little flare-ups, and we sometimes see very strong instances of science and religion cooperating strongly to produce scientific knowledge.
And how did it come to be that during modernity the conflict narrative is so dominant, so self-evident, as it were?
I think there's a number of reasons. I mean, in the 19th century, there were two English thinkers who, as it were, invented the idea of a conflict between science and religion, and it seems to have taken off from there. Although there were precedents for this idea of conflict with Protestant attacks on Catholicism, accusing them of being anti-science, and to some extent during the Enlightenment, this Protestant attack on Catholicism was broadened and generalised by some of the Enlightenment thinkers into the idea of a general tension between science and religion. And then finally in the 19th century this crystallises into the conflict thesis, as we now know, the idea that there was a perennial tension between science and religion going right back to the Greeks.
In popular culture we have the idea that science is one unitary thing, which has one method, which is objective and mercilessly non-axiomatic. But in your research in the history of science, does another picture emerge?
Indeed, indeed. And if we look at the very term science, it's only really in the 19th century that science comes to take on its present meaning. And so very different disciplines, natural history, natural philosophy, mathematics, mixed mathematical sciences, these were all brought together and they were given the single label, in English at least, science. And there was also invented a category, the scientist, who was the person who conducted these activities. And also at this time we get the idea of a single unitary scientific method that's uniquely rational.
If I were the average layperson, I would ask, and I am the average layperson,
right.
How was it different prior to modernity? What was the nature of science prior to modernity?
Well, there are a number of different approaches to the study of nature: the mathematical, historical, natural history, philosophical, natural philosophy, and natural philosophy. So if you look at the words that people used to describe their activities, they didn't talk about science. They talked about natural philosophy, natural history, mathematics, astronomy, and these meant quite different things. Natural philosophy, for example, typically included the study of God and the soul in various ways. Now, modern science wouldn't consider those things to be under its ambit. So the methods and subject matters were quite different in the past to what they are today.
In Territories of Science and Religion, you describe today's science and religion as two different bodies of knowledge, self-sustained bodies of knowledge, while the pre-modern predecessors are described by you as moral virtues of the individual. How is a contemporary person to understand this previous phase in science and religion?
Well, one way of thinking about it is to use the analogy of territories and to think about the ways in which, over time, although geographic territory itself doesn't change, the way we map them changes. So the state of Israel would be a good example. Palestine has been there for a long time, but the territory Israel really only came into existence in a significant way after the Second World War. So that although the geography had always been there, the way of conceptualising it as a particular entity is a modern one, and the same too with our notions of science and of religion. And as you say, if we look at the words, the Latin, for example, religio, and the Latin scientia, from which we get our words religion and science, in the Middle Ages these were both virtues, internal capacities of the person, and gradually during the modern period these inner virtues have been objectified and reified, and they've had boundaries drawn around them in quite a different way, and they become bodies of knowledge, typically.
And the penultimate question, what about religion? I mean, today we see religion as an abstract phenomenon containing all other particular religions. If I understand correctly from Territories, this emerged at some point. I think it had to do with the colonies, etc. Yes. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, if we look at the religious documents of any of the traditions, any of the canonical documents, in Christianity this would be the Bible. If we look at medieval thinking, the word religion rarely appears. So that people in this tradition don't imagine themselves to be religious. But from about the 17th century, this word religion becomes increasingly more important, and we get the idea, typically, usually following the Protestant Reformation, that there are individual religions that are constituted by beliefs and practices, and that there are world religions that mirror that pattern, and gradually we get the idea that there's Buddhism and Hinduism, so-called Eastern religions. But this idea of a single generic religion, and that there are plural religions that are constituted by beliefs and practices, is a relatively recent idea, that is to say, since the 17th century.
And the very last question, now it's a number of decades that this work in the history of science has been conducted. It hasn't quite reached the public sphere, as it seems, which is dominated by discussions on creative design versus Darwinian evolution, on new atheism, etc. So how do you see the future, if I may ask this?
Well, I think you're right to say that there are contemporary manifestations of science, what looks like science and religion conflict, with religiously motivated anti-evolutionism and intelligent design on one side, and new atheists like Richard Dawkins on the other side. I think that those battles will die down. Certainly, I don't think the new atheists are taken as seriously as they were, say, 10 or 15 years ago. As for religiously inspired anti-evolutionism, I think that will probably be with us for a long time. But we should understand that these people have a high view of science. They don't consider themselves to be anti-science. They consider themselves to be against a particular theory that they don't believe to be genuinely scientific. And what they really object to is what they think are the moral implications of this. So even young earth creationism and intelligent design shouldn't be fitted into the mould of science-religion conflict. It's more complicated than that.
Professor Peter Harrison, thank you very, very much.
It's a pleasure.
We may only remain with the hope that the Territories of Science and Religion will be soon translated into Greek. Thank you.